kind of business. Yeah. I was going to say promotion was a strong word.
Good evening, everybody. I'd like to call this meeting to order, please. I want to first start by doing a roll call of officers present. My name is Doug Clemens. I'm chairman of the CAG.
Bob Allen, Vice Chairman of the CAG.
Robert Steelman, Treasurer. Rita Wilson, Secretary.
Bill Wilson, member at large.
And Lynn Lee is also a member at large, and he is absent with excuse this evening. The first item on our agenda is approval of minutes from our last meeting. So basically, we're going to do a verbal approval, looking for any corrections needed onto those minutes. Already, I've seen no corrections. Any opposition to moving forward the minutes to be entered in the record as written? Very good. We're moving to set those minutes into our record with no amendments. The next thing on our agenda is new member nomination. Now, membership here has a few attendance requirements and areas around the geographic requirements as to where you live or work to be a member of the CAG. We have quite a few members who have actually qualified for membership this evening, and basically we want to see who those folks are and have them stand for nomination and vote.
I'd like to present 6 nominees from inside the 2-mile radius, specifically Spanish Village. We have Carol Parsons, Marge Minke, Robin and Mike Daly, Tanya and Mike Mason. If you'll stand, please. And we have 2 nominations from outside the radius, Wendy and Joe Lumetta from St. Charles.
Okay, thank you all for expressing interest in participating in the CAG. At this time, I'm looking for a motion to accept the new nominees as members of this organization. I see a motion and a second.
Second.
Very good. And yeas, please, by show of hands. Any opposition to any of the members? Thank you and welcome aboard. We'll get you your voting cards. All right, and back down to the other side of the table here for the treasurer's report.
We had no activity in the treasurer. We had no income and no outflow, so we sit at a balance of $396.55.
And if anybody doesn't like the sound of that, please feel free to see us after the meeting with a check. We can also take that contribution to the website. We're planning on some big things coming up, and we'd definitely love to cover the expenses of printing up an agenda for every meeting. The executive committee report, we met on August the 28th, and there were 5 of us present and had a quorum. We discussed the renewal of our website, which costs money, and approved the spending on that. We also are looking for help in a couple areas. One of the areas is to help out with our recording secretary and with our treasurer in terms of their responsibilities. So if we have any volunteers in the subcommittee, we'd be very happy to have that happen. We decided to not continue with a P.O. box. If anyone wishes to mail, they can mail to the CAG's address, which is 10518 Boylston Drive, St. Missouri, 63074. We also made a couple decisions about the course of this meeting. Mary with the EPA has offered to have one-on-one discussion with individuals for the last 15 minutes of the evening. So we would like to break the meeting at 8:15 and allow the EPA the last 15 minutes of their time here to have any personal discussions and questions answered on a one-on-one basis. We also agreed to have the Army Corps of Engineers make a presentation this evening about radioactive safety levels. The nominating committee has been selected for our upcoming election. That would be Chuck and Kathy Bell and Donna Cloppinger. Just raise your hands out there in the audience. Anyone interested in running for chair or vice chair would please see them before November. We will be having an election in December of this year. Our next public meeting was discussed for a time in October, and We have not actually set that time, given some personal travel recommendations. We also need to speak to EPA about that. Now, this evening, we are having a presentation this evening. We're going to have an open question and answer period with the EPA. And I know there are a couple things on folks' minds. There's an individual who's a foremost authority, one of two authorities in landfill fires in the nation, by the name of Todd Thalhammer. Todd Thalhammer recently submitted a report to the Missouri Department of Natural Resources. Missouri Department of Natural Resources governs half of the landfill. There's a jurisdictional line going through this landfill. Where the radioactively impacted materials sit falls under the jurisdiction of the Environmental Protection Agency. The rest of the landfill falls under the state of Missouri's Department of Natural Resources and landfill management. Now, there is a subsurface smoldering event which is currently in the landfill and moving. Todd Thalhammer's recent report indicates that it has crossed through a thing that we all call the neck. The neck is a narrow area which links the south and north quarries. The south quarry is where the radioactive materials are. It is believed at this time by Todd Thalhammer that the fire had moved beyond the neck, which would be a nice stopping point for it. There are a number of concerns as a result of that this body wants to express, and I know that a number of you in the audience would like to express. That there was a trench, and we call it the trench, but our Attorney General, and bless him for actually having this lawsuit to mandate something be done about the smoldering event reaching the radiologically impacted materials, but I don't think he did enough of the research that he needed to do in terms of what needed to be done in a quick manner. The idea of digging a hole and putting non-flammable materials in it to stop as a barrier seemed like a great idea. Unfortunately, we have to find a place to dig that trench where there isn't radiologically impacted material, or at least a lot of it, because that's going to slow down construction. Every time you hit it, you have to contain it, barrel it up, and ship it off. Now, they haven't found a clean line yet, and it's been 9 months since the mandate had begun work. So we sit here 9 months into it without even a place to start digging. And the fire isn't paying attention to court documents. It keeps moving. And I think that's a level of concern in this community right now that needs to be addressed this evening. And I hope that it will be. But I do want to put that out there. This report is there, and I also want to enter that report into our public record. That's a Missouri Department of Natural Resources report, and I'll put the actual citations into our minutes when we put those out. Moving on, during new business, we traditionally ask for any elected officials or representatives to please stand and indicate who you are and who you're representing. So at this time, I'd like to just start in this half of the room and move through.
Carrie D. Gregorio, Senator Roy Blunt's office.
Jennifer Hoskins, Senator Blunt's office.
Jordan Beers, Congresswoman Ann Wagner's office.
Gerald Bruner, City of Bridgeton, Ward 2. Randy Heim, City of Bridgeton, Councilman, Ward 3. Harvey Bergman, State Representative of the Ohio office.
Kurt Fetch, City of Bridgeton, Ward 3.
Yeah, I think we've got everybody there. And I would like to say that the Pattonville Fire District is also represented in the room. And now I'd like to move forward in calling for new business. Are there any motions to be made on the floor? Seeing none, I would actually like to open up the presentation from the Kansas City Army Corps of Engineers on this evening's agenda. So, do you need the microphone?
Yes.
I think we're going to use it.
Well, they're going to do the
Good evening, everybody. My name is Ben Washburn. I know many of you. I see some new faces in here.
Just want to say hello. For those of you that don't know me, encourage you to contact me anytime you have any questions about the site. Call me, email me, whatever is most convenient for you, and I'll be there to do what I can. I want to bring your attention to one update that we made on our website, and that's the path ahead. We don't have the printout here this month, but we've done a new format, trying to make it more engaging, more informative for you guys, kind of at the request of some of the feedback we received at the last CAG meeting. And that's posted on our website, the standard West Lake website that we've been using. As Doug mentioned, Robin Kiefer is here with her team from the Corps of Engineers. They're going to give a presentation tonight on radiation risk. It's something that we've been discussing that we think is going to be useful information for you guys. And then, as Doug said, we'll try to leave about 15 minutes at the end for some one-on-one availability. And that's not just for EPA. I think the Corps would be happy to speak with you guys. We have ATSDR here. They'd be happy to speak with anybody that has questions. We know that not everyone may want to get up on the microphone, so we think it's important that people that don't have that comfort level still have the availability to speak with us one-on-one. And so that's all I have. Please feel free to contact me anytime you have any questions. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Robin.
Good evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Robin Kiefer. I'm the Corps of Engineers project manager for the site. We're supporting EPA in the isolation barrier construction and design. And I'd like to introduce my team, so afterwards, if you want to talk with any of those folks, feel free to. Jason Liebert is our engineering branch chief for our environmental engineering branch. We've got Mike Peterson, who is public affairs. And we've got Joe Donikowski, who is one of our health physicists. Joe will be giving a presentation tonight. And as Ben mentioned, the presentation tonight is on risk perspectives. And over the last several CAGs, we've had several questions that keep coming up again and again. One of them is, what is a safe radiation dose? The other is, what is the background level for a non-nuclear city? And it dawned on us that there is some basic information that we think you guys will really benefit from. And that information is basically what is the CERCLA process, or what is the regulatory process that every hazardous waste site needs to follow in the country. And these processes are done to ensure public safety. So we want to go over some of those things. Now, we're just going to be talking about the processes themselves tonight. We're not going to delve into the details of West Lake. What EPA has said that they're willing to do is they'll come back at the next CAG, or whenever it's convenient for you all, for your agenda, and talk specifically about that information for West Lake. So with that being said, we'd like you to hold all your questions till the end. We'll answer questions within the time available. If you have any other questions, we'll be available afterwards to answer those as well. And right now I'd like to turn this over to Joe Donikowski. He's our health physicist.
All right. Thank you, Robin. I just want to say thank you, everybody, for your time. We appreciate the chance to come out here and talk a little bit. Like Robin said, we're just going to be giving a sort of high-level talk on some fundamentals of radiation safety, and how this ties into the Superfund process, and hopefully build a good foundation for future talks going forward. So, here's just a quick outline of the discussion we'll be presenting tonight. The first big question being, what is a safe level of radiation? We're going to try to touch on that by answering some questions and go into a little bit about radiation basics and sort of radiation 101. We're going to look at the concept of radiation dose and how that ties into risk management, and risk assessment. And we'll discuss a little bit of how we tie all these things into our public policy and our regulatory approach to radiation cleanup sites. The other big topic is, how do we actually determine when a site needs remediation? And we'll be going over the concept of how we perform risk assessments, how the remediation goals are derived from these risk assessments, and what the difference is between an established remediation goal versus the preliminary remediation goals. This slide covers a lot, and I apologize if it's a little busy, but this is sort of the very, very basic terminology we use when we're discussing radioactivity at environmental sites. Radioactivity fundamentally is the underlying concept of atoms decaying over time. So the amount of radioactivity present in a material is just the amount of atoms that are decaying into a different substance. For very low contamination levels, like we typically discuss at environmental sites, the term you'll hear a lot is picocuries. That's just a measurement of activity, and pico carries a very, very small amount of radiation. For reference, 1 picocurie equals almost exactly 2.22 atoms undergoing a decay every minute. So in the context of a gram of material consisting of trillions and trillions of atoms, picocuries are very small levels. The way atoms decay is they simply release energy or particles, and those are the dangerous elements of radioactivity. So when we discuss the dose delivered by a radioactive particle, what we're really talking about is us being imparted energy by either photons or particles being emitted by these radioactive atoms. And the result of being given a dose by a particle is just called exposure. Dose is the unit we use when we talk about exposure, and again, at environmental cleanup sites here in the United States, we use the unit of millirem, which is 1/1000th of a rem. Again, this is a small amount in the context of everyday background exposure. We need to convert doses into risk when working at Superfund sites because Superfund sites deal with risk ranges. Risk itself is just a unitless concept that's used to express the potential negative health impacts of exposure to harmful chemicals. At Superfund sites, we talk about this in the context of risk is the chance that chemicals from a site will actually cause some sort of negative health impact. And dose is directly related to risk. So generally speaking, the higher radiation dose you're being exposed to, the greater the radioactive risk. Next slide. This topic, we're just going to try to deal with the concept of what is natural radiation, what are typical background levels. So it's important to understand that exposure to radiation isn't something that happens only in special occasions, like when you go and get an X-ray or a dental X-ray. Radiation is all around us at all times. Everybody's being imparted with some kind of radioactive dose every moment of every day. Just some examples of natural radioactive material are cosmic photons that come from the sun or even from outside our solar system. Normal terrestrial materials present in the Earth's crust, things like uranium, radium, and thorium are present in soil everywhere across the world. The food we eat contains radioactive material. Materials that we eat can be incorporated into our bodies. All of the air contains natural radioactivity. All of the water we drink contains some levels of natural radioactivity. And we're also exposed to man-made sources such as things like medical exposure or consumer products and things of that nature. Next slide. This chart just sort of gives a breakout of the sources that we're being exposed to daily. I guess the big takeaway is the average exposure for a citizen of the United States right now is about 620 millirem per year. That excludes exposure from medical sources like CT scans. And that accounts for a growing part of our exposure as we use more and more medical technology every day. Pulling out medical coverage, the average dose for the St. Louis area is about 340 millirem per year. And you can see from up here, natural radon and thoron play a big part of that. Nuclear medicine is part of that. CT scanning is a very big part that's growing, an increasingly large component of our dose. And there's things like terrestrial background and space background up there. We'll talk a little bit more that later. Next slide. So the big challenge in health physics is how do we actually extrapolate, determine what the risk is from dose. Because we're constantly being exposed, we have to do some sort of calculations to determine, well, what's a safe or acceptable level of radiation exposure. There's a lot of data available for very high exposures to radiation. This data primarily comes from things like nuclear atomic weapons exposure from World War II and large-scale industrial accidents. So we have a lot of data and a very good understanding of the health impacts from radiation at very high doses. What we don't really have is any good data on low levels of exposure and what the harmful effects might be. The way we approach our regulatory policy is to take the effects and this range of well-verified effects, these very high doses, and assume that there's a consistent and linear extrapolation from high doses down to low doses. There's several approaches to do that, and here in the United States we take what's called the linear no-threshold model. It's the most conservative, commonly accepted model of dose extrapolation, and this is what we base all of our regulations and public policy on, is this concept that any exposure to radiation has some level of risk associated with that, and the risk is directly linear to the amount of radiation received. Next slide. So our regulatory approach is based on this linear no-threshold dose model. And like I said, this is a very conservative approach. Some countries do things a little bit differently. But because it's a conservative model, it likely overestimates the risk from exposure. This model assumes that any dose of radiation has the potential to cause a equivalent negative health impact. And here in the second bullet, we just state that it's important to understand that just having exposure to radiation, every activity humans engage in carries some level of risk. When we're discussing the risk from radiation at cleanup sites like this, it's important to understand that we state these exposures in terms of acceptable risk. The word safe isn't used because there's a lot of interpretations you can go with that, and there's no fundamental unit of safety. But we can do a good job of quantifying risk via risk assessments. This is just a little bit more about the regulatory approach as it relates to CERCLA and the Superfund process. CERCLA here's the regulatory citation for CERCLA, and how we define that at Superfund site, the acceptable risk range for carcinogens is somewhere between a 1 in 10,000 to a 1 in a million lifetime increase of cancer risk. And we just have to note that we use cancer morbidity and not cancer mortality. So we're really looking at just the generation of an occurrence of cancer, not necessarily a fatality from that cancer. And for reference, right now, according to the American Cancer Society, the typical person, for men, you've got roughly a 50% chance of getting cancer. For women, that number's a little lower at about 1 in 3. And then we have the comparative risk of death also as cancer is about 1 in 4 for men or 1 in 5 for females. And just a good ballpark for sort of what the upper end of the CERCLA risk range corresponds to is driving statistics in St. Louis say that 1 in 10,000 fatalities occur from a car accident. This graph over on the right side is fast spectrum from basic doses. You can see on the right side, this red bar represents the acceptable CERCLA risk range. And it's below the risk from things like indoor natural radon, frequent airline flights expose you to more radiation. Even cosmic radiation at sea level is greater than the CERCLA acceptable risk range. And that's just trying to hammer out some perspective. Next slide. So just to summarize to this point, it's important to understand that everybody's being exposed to radiation every day, and it's not a singular rare occurrence. Here in the United States, our regulations are based on very conservative approaches to dose modeling. The regulatory approach under Superfund is to state risks in terms of acceptable risk and the risk range. And this is defined to be 1 in 10,000 to 1 in a million additional cancer risk. Next slide. So how do we actually approach quantifying risk and determine whether or not a site needs to be cleaned up? The hazardous waste regulations in the United States require that any sort of site that has the potential to have negative health impact, you need to perform a health-based risk assessment. This risk assessment feeds into a lot of the decision-making processes that helps make decisions regarding what contaminants are potentially the risk drivers and what the exposed populations could be. So risk assessment, like I said, determines whether or not there's actually a risk present at the site, who in the surrounding community could be at risk, how great that risk could potentially be, and what's driving the potential for that risk. The risk assessment we perform don't look at just singular things. We evaluate all exposure scenarios. So we'll look at both radiological and chemical impacts from sites. We look at all potential medias. The examples here are soil, groundwater, surface water, air, dust. But we look at the whole spectrum of what potential media could be. When we discuss receptors, we look at both residents, on-site workers, the potential for intruders, the potential for future agricultural use. And ultimately, we need to determine what the exposure pathways are. So we look at what's the potential risk from inhalation versus what's the potential external exposure. All of these factors are, incorporated in the secret model, so they're all summed. Nothing's looked at in a bubble or in a vacuum. Everything ties in together. And at the Superfund site, if the risk exceeds approximately 1 in 10,000, action may be required at the site. Types of actions we undertake at Superfund sites include things like engineering controls, land use controls, potential remediation of sites. So in addition to providing information on what the risk drivers are, risk assessments also help us understand what remedial actions and objectives may be helpful. Next slide. Here's just a graphic illustrating all the potential pathways some models look at. You can see even things like drinking milk from cows, ingestion of contaminated grass might be. So the risk assessment process isn't just a simple one-line thing. It's a very involved model that includes considerations for all the atmospheric and elemental properties that could be present at a site. Next slide. When evaluating pathways and doing these risk assessments, it's the completed pathways that we're concerned about, that is, what is actually present and practical to look at a site. The example here is just if groundwater isn't being used, then there's no complete pathway for groundwater, and that component of the risk assessment may not necessarily be considered. If surface soils are contaminated, then there would be things like off-site exposure. So we look at all land use considerations, and it's not just a snapshot in time. We project these risk assessments out into the foreseeable future. Carcinogens and non-carcinogens alike are evaluated, and for non-carcinogens, we use a thing called a hazard quotient instead of risk range to determine the effects. And every element of our risk assessments incorporate lots and lots of conservative factors. They're built into each individual variable of the models we use. These conservative assumptions generally result in risk assessments that are overestimating risk and taking a conservative approach. So here's just an example risk assessment exposure scenario we sort of pulled together. If we assume that the current site conditions, like we have current site impacted with uranium, thorium, and radium, we would look at the potentially impacted media, such as surface or subsurface soils. We would look at things like, what is the site situation? Is it an open field or is it a pure situation? What type of land use controls are present? Can people build residence on a home, on a site? Will it be used for industrial use in the future? And we'll incorporate all the available environmental data that's been generated from the site, as well as look at things like computer models to determine potential groundwater exposure, potential air exposure from particulate emissions, and things like that. We also look at potential receptors. So in this hypothetical scenario, we could be looking at on-site workers, on-site security staff who may be exposed to a small amount of time. What's the potential for trespassers to be on site? And a future potential receptors, try to pull that out even further and think, well, what could the adjacent building user, if somebody constructs a building next to the site, what could that potential pathway be? If a commercial building is constructed, even if there's a residential easement, how could that be impacting the site? So we try to project any potential problematic future receptors. And again, we look at the potentially complete exposure pathways. So in this example, we just talked about the potential inhalation of fugitive dust, whether or not there could be direct ingestion and eating of contaminated material, or even things like material being deposited in the skin and having dermal contact with chemicals or radiological material. Next slide. So in this scenario, for every potential receptor we look at, we would evaluate every pathway. We would look at every chemical, we would look at every radionuclide of concern, and perform an evaluation. This equation right here is just sort of a simplified example of how we calculate risk. But one of the important things to pull out is when we actually input these parameters, we try to use actual concentrations and come up with conservative assumptions for, well, how much could a human being conceivably inhale in a day? How long can somebody conceivably be exposed to that location? What's the upper end of the average human body weight? How much material can the human body actually bioaccumulate over time? And each of these parameters we use upper bounds to try to incorporate a conservative factor to each factor. So you can see there's multiple conservative elements in each equation. The complete pathways and calculations are performed for all of these, and then all of the calculated risks are added together. So we're not trying to break out individual components. When we do risk assessments, we look at total site risk. And on Superfund sites, again, if the result of all this risk assessment is there's a total cancer risk that's greater than 1 in 10,000, remedial action that we require. Here is one of the places where we briefly try to touch on West Lake, and we just discussed that the baseline risk assessment was performed in the year 2000. Looked at OU1, areas 1 and 2, and the Ford property. It evaluated all the potential carcinogens and non-carcinogens at the site. It had a 1,000-year period of performance, so it evaluated risks over the next 1,000 years. And based on this risk assessment, there was no exposure to an off-site resident, and the future risks for groundskeeper and outside storage workers were what was driving the risk. That is to say, people who could potentially be working as groundkeepers at West Lake in the future had a greater than 1 in 10,000 risk. So that was what the decision to implement a remedy at West Lake was based on. Next slide. So once you get to a point where you've determined there's an unacceptable risk at an environmental cleanup site, you need to begin to establish remedial goals. And the point of this slide is just to quickly discuss how we actually determine what these goals are. Another term you might hear is things like cleanup criteria or remedial action goals, and they're all kind of the fundamental same things. They're the levels we set to ensure the protectiveness of a site. These remedial goals are primarily determined based on the appropriate regulations of the United States, or they could be risk-based and determined specifically for a site based on site-specific considerations. So some examples of regulatory limits, that is to say regulations that are passed by law by the Congress or by local states, are things like EPA's maximum contaminant levels for drinking water. The UMTRCA regulation, which is also being applied at West Lake, is an example of a promulgated United States regulation. The other side of that is we also do look at risk-based remedial goals. These are established just to determine what levels of a contaminant will result in an unacceptable level of risk. And these remedial action goals we determine are contaminant specific, so each sort of radionuclide or chemical on a site will have its own remedial action goal. They're also specific to the media, so there'll be different goals for air versus soil versus water. And all of these goals are set to demonstrate compliance ultimately with whatever the established remedial action objective for the site is, and ensure that it is protective of the human health and the environment. Next slide. The purpose of this slide is to briefly discuss what the background of natural radioactive material present in nature has on selecting remedial goals and applying them. When constituents aren't naturally occurring, we don't really consider background, and examples of that would be like industrial radiography sources and things like that. But when constituents are present in background, they can be present at levels that are comparable to the remedial action goals. So background concentrations need to be determined and applied to a site because we state things in terms of excess risk. Naturally occurring constituents typically don't get remediated, so these background levels are added to the established remedial action goals. Next slide. Oftentimes in reports, background values are stated as a single simple value, such as the average background. But it's important to understand that background levels vary considerably among geographic locations and different material types. And there's no single number that's representative of any kind of radioactive material. This table, we just pulled out the sort of average backgrounds in a typical range for the United States and the state of Missouri. We also went outside the United States and looked at Russia and Greece. And at the bottom, we've included West Lake. So you can sort of just see a good rule of thumb for all these radionuclides like uranium, radium, thorium is they typically range between about 0 and 2 picocuries per gram. An average value of 1 is typical, but you can see values as high as, say, 4 or 5 picocuries in just naturally occurring material. And when we discuss background numbers, we try to find a good number that's representative of the range. And that may be the average, but sometimes it's not. Next slide. And this ties into a couple things, but one of the big takeaways is that different sites being cleaned up can have different remedial action goals. And this is just due to the fact that there's a lot of things that impact the selection of a remedial action goal. Things like who is the regulatory oversight, what the radiation standards being applied are, how the health assessment is approached, what the pathways considered are, what the current future land use is, what potential controls exist for land use. Just the basic input parameters. Some states have very specific and prescriptive things like breathing rates you need to incorporate, and that can vary from site to site. And the physical settings of site goal are an important factor in how we determine remediation goals. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach to environmental remediation. Next slide. This ties back into a little bit the background discussion, and this is just a breakout of how the West Lake background was determined, the value that's being used. Here they're using the mean plus 2 standard deviations, and we have the data. I can discuss it a little more in detail, but the big takeaway is that the background being used at West Lake is compares very well to the Missouri mean. It's actually slightly below what the average radiation levels in Missouri were. Because UMTRCA is an ARAR that applies to radium and thorium, and these are naturally occurring elements, we need to add our background components into our remediation goals. The UMTRCA ARAR being applied at West Lake is 5 picocuries plus background for radium-226 and thorium-232. So based on the 2.9 number, that's representative of background, and the cleanup goal of 5, The derived remediation goal for the project is 7.9 picocuries per gram. And I guess it's important that we cite here that UMTRCA is based on a residential occupancy scenario. That is to say that this would be a level that would be safe to build a house on and live in. Because that's not necessarily the scenario being envisioned right now, this is a conservative goal, and it's being used more as a screening tool than as a remediation goal. So, next slide. The purpose of this slide is to discuss the difference between what an established remediation goal is and what a preliminary remediation goal is, and the difference is sort of just the word preliminary. PRGs is used as a very initial investigation tool when there's no other available data present on a site. PRGs are intended to be very conservative tools, in addition to all the conservative parameters discussed before. They assume a whole bunch of various conservative scenarios. And PRGs generally, well, they follow the acceptable circular risk range and are established at a baseline of 1 in a million cancer risk. So, next slide. And this slide just discusses the comparison of what a 1 in a million cancer risk equates to based on other things taken from the National Safety Center. And you can see, between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in a million, there's things like accidental fireworks discharges, 1 in 650,000. Lightning strike equates to about 1 in 100,000. Death from storms is slightly below the 1 in 10,000 action risk. And this is just a discussion of the relative risks. So when we're talking about establishing PRGs at the 1 in a million level, they're very, very low levels. Next slide.
Do you mind putting the microphone up so we can hear?
Yeah, sorry about that. Is this better?
Yeah, quite a bit.
Okay, thank you. This is just a summary slide of what the difference between a PRG and an RG is. Preliminary remediation goals are preliminary, they're not the final remediation goals that get applied to cleanup sites. But they are contamination specific. They're risk-based, based on general conservative scenarios. They don't consider things like site specifics, technical feasibility, things like resources, costs, regulations, site background. They really are just initial levels used when there's no other considerations in play. They're used as screening tools and they're very conservative. Established remediation goals have the same contaminant media specific inputs, but they do consider things like site-specific features, what the actual regulatory approach of the site is. They take into consideration things like acceptable risk based on the risk assessments that are done. And they're ultimately used as the final product to determine whether or not remediation goals have been actually achieved at a site. Next slide. So just to give a quick summary of that, fundamentally remediation goals are either risk-based or determined by regulations passed into law. Remediation goals will differ from site to site based on all sorts of different considerations. When you're dealing with sites that are contaminated with material that's present in nature, it's important to have an established background and understand that background levels vary and actually represent a wide range of numbers and aren't just a single specific value. Preliminary remediation goals, like we discussed, are used as screening tools only and generally aren't applied as final remedial action levels, and they're intended to be a conservative estimate of areas that could require more investigation. So when it all ties back to what is the safe level of radiation, we just discussed that radiation exposure occurs on an everyday basis. Everyone's always being exposed to radiation. Our regulatory approach in the United States is very conservative, and it's based on the assumption that any exposure to radiation carries some potential for adverse health effects. Our regulatory approach isn't to discuss things in terms of safety, but in terms of acceptable risk. And on Superfund sites, the acceptable risk level is given between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in a million. To actually determine if a site meets those levels or not, we perform risk assessments. Risk assessments look at who's being exposed, what they're being exposed to, when they're being exposed to it, and how they're being exposed to it. And if the results of these risk assessments are that there's a risk greater than 1 in 10,000 chance, we undertake some kind of remedial action. So that's the presentation. I guess at this point we'll take some questions.
Generally, we do Q&A. Traditionally is please raise your hand. You'll be recognized by myself. And if you need the microphone, we'll figure out a way to get you to it. And please identify yourself.
Yeah, my name is Ed Smith. I work for the Missouri Coalition for the Environment. please correct me if I'm wrong, it's my understanding that food wrap uses a 10,000-year risk assessment for food wrap sites in St. Louis.
I would have to actually have you talk to the St. Louis food scrap person because I have not worked on St. Louis sites, so I couldn't tell you how they do their risk assessments.
Have you worked on food wrap before?
Yes, I work on Kansas City sites in Region 2.
I guess, is there anybody here that can answer that question?
Food scrap?
Yeah. Okay. I guess the concern being the radioactive material at the landfill is going to become more radiotoxic over the next 9,000 years, and using a 1,000-year risk assessment doesn't seem appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you have a question about how EPA approaches the regulatory approach, that's EPA can say whether there's a 1,000-year range.
I was trying to get
Yeah.
the answer from the court, so that's why I asked.
Right. Yeah, if you have a question for St. Louis food scrap, they can certainly tell you how they've applied it, but I can't speak for what they've done.
I've got a question real quick. Gamma and alpha particle detection. My understanding, I'm a layman, not a scientist. I'm a layman, not a scientist. It's my understanding that alpha particles are incredibly harmful, but hard to contact. Your skin generally stops them. However, if you internalize them somehow, breathe them in, consume them, and then some radioisotopes, like some of the things that we have in our area here, the gamma radiation coming off those things that can be detected with a CAG counter, for example, doesn't emit much gamma, but it's a strong alpha. Can you explain that a little bit to me and help me through that?
Maybe. Are you asking how you can detect alpha-emitting particles with like a sodium-iodide detector? Any material that emits alpha particles can also create daughter products, and those daughter products can be gamma emitters. So as long as the material is in equilibrium, you can detect the daughter products for things like uranium or thorium, things like radium-226 emit gammas, lead-214 and bismuth-214 emit gammas. So if you're detecting the gamma emissions for the daughter products, then you can interpret what the concentrations of the alpha emitters would be.
So you're looking for basically the daughter products of the stuff
Correct.
you're trying to find?
That's correct.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Okay. Yes. Gentleman in the red shirt, I know your phone just went off, but you're next on the list.
My name is Joe Nutt. I just got brought into the group. We've been here the whole time. I noticed on the graphs here, the charts and everything, they refer to air pollution. And, you know, it says things for ground and soil, but it's just talking specifically on air. I think we're mixing up some of our parameters here by saying, oh, here's some formulas, and here's what we have, and now here's West Lake, and you start making calls on it. But, I mean, I was looking at that formula, that just talks about air exposure. So do not all of the other types of exposure factor into here? And
that was a simple example, but every media is looked at in the risk assessments. So it's not specific to air.
Just go ahead.
Here.
Yes.
Yeah, Linda Eaker, Richmond City Council. With what you just presented, which was very simple, and I don't mean in a bad way.
Helps get people to speed.
Yes, explanation. It seems amazing to me that they could have remediated anything anywhere with such broad parameters. And so has it been a mistake to remediate or remove the waste from other places? And have other places had the same situation as we have with the fire that's nearby and closer all the time, and in a tornado area and an earthquake zone?
Well, I haven't worked on any sites like this, but I can't speak for what's happening everywhere in the country. If you're asking, are there sites where the risk range is exceeded based on radionuclides? Yeah, I mean, I work on food scrap sites that are being remediated because there's an unacceptable, greater than 1 in 10,000 cancer risk. So.
Well, you talked about the 1 in a million health risk, and your parameters are awfully, as you said, conservative, awfully wide. So, what do you know about the other areas in St. Louis where they have done things with the same waste?
You're talking about St. Louis Foods Wrap, Army Corps of Engineers. Do you know anything about those projects?
I mean, I know they exist and I know the health physicists, but I haven't been involved in those risk assessment processes or anything like that, so I guess.
Maybe you
I
should,
can.
maybe you could learn a little bit. Just a suggestion.
Fingerprint data, when you have everything all together?
Generally, to answer your question, excuse me, to answer your question, the St. Louis Foods Wrap, all sites that are hazardous waste sites follow the same process. Now, there are differences in how the remediation goals are set up, as the slide pointed out, and there was a number of variables as why they were different. Different regulators that are running it, they have different interpretations. There are different different site parameters. There's a number of things. So you can't, they all follow the same process. And my understanding is that, my understanding is that there are different levels between Foods Wrap and West Lake. And what we would need you to do is have your specific questions and submit those, and we'll try and get an answer for you on what that specific question is.
May I follow up? You mentioned on the interpretation being made by the regulators. So it's not as scientific as you're saying if they're making different interpretations of the data. Can you respond to that? I understand different sites, but when you're taking the data.
Actually, that was going to be my question too. So.
Well, for instance, when I say different interpretations, like some state agencies have specifically promulgated regulations that they say you must meet this standard. Others don't. If you're working in that state or working in that county for some reason, you've got to follow that interpretation, what they've interpreted. So you've got to follow those standards.
So there's not a standard for the Army Corps dealing with this?
No, we follow wherever we're working, we follow what those, wherever we're working, we're working in New Jersey and they have a specific regulation, we've got to follow what is stated in that, for that state.
Let me jump in on
But
that.
in St. Louis County, where many of these sites exist, would they be following the same regulations?
Well, Army Corps of Engineers is a subcontractor, basically. They're the feet on the ground that work for a lot of these agencies. And one of the questions I do have is why do these agencies, in your experience, your feet on the ground, you're being told one thing by the EPA and another thing by Foods Wrap, why? Why do they have different interpretations of the law? Isn't there like, if you live in a residential area, for example, and you don't want somebody blasting their stereo or having their muffler too loud, you set a sound level by decibel, and you bring out and see if they're breaking the law. So my question is, how can that level be different across federal agencies when they're governed by the same government? And you might not be able to answer that.
And I can't. If you can give me a specific example, we can go and investigate why they would be different. But off the top of our heads.
And that's a perfectly reasonable answer. It has always dismayed me, to say the least. And Ed, you had a question. We'll get to everybody. Don, you're next, and then you're. So Ed.
Yeah. Going through the slides, you had a picture of what I would call a reference man, a white Caucasian man in his 30s, for two of your slides. And it's my understanding, based off the biological effects of ionizing radiation reports, which there have been 7 by the National Academy of Sciences, ionizing radiation impacts children at a higher rate, or they're at a higher risk, and women than a Caucasian white male. Are you guys taking those population risks into consideration, both age, ethnic diversity, things like that, when you're putting together your risk calculations, or are they all based on reference?
Programs like ResRad or EPA's PRGs do take into consideration things like youth. So yes, we do. If you're asking how it was done specifically at West Lake, I couldn't tell you how they incorporated these factors into their risk assessment. But yes, when we do risk assessments, we do consider things like age.
A smoldering fire or fire of any kind wasn't considered in the risk assessment here, so
right.
That's something that we've got issue with.
So the 1 in 10,000.
Well, actually, ma'am, she's next.
Right. I was just going to follow up with you.
I
I think I'm hitting on her question too. You mentioned, since we're talking about dosage, you said there are no, what did you say? There's no good data on low-level exposure?
Correct.
So what are these risk models based off of? If you don't know what you have.
Risk models are based on data from like atomic weapon survivors, from industrial accidents and things like
But
that.
those are people that have been exposed, like maybe a worst case scenario here at West Lake where it gets airborne and all of a sudden we're out and we get exposed. What about people who have lived here for 30 plus years getting above, because you said, there's a 1 in 10,000 risk, but if you don't have good data that shows low level exposure, how do you know that's not greater? You've got people that have lived here for 30 years.
The fundamental way we do the risk assessments is to assume that these worst case scenarios are also true for low levels of exposure. And they're extrapolated down.
Okay, so
does that make sense?
So it's a hypothesis.
Correct.
So
there is no evidence that exposure to very low levels of radiation has an adverse health effect. But there is evidence that very high levels of radiation do have adverse health effects.
Right.
So to be conservative, we assume that those health effects are also true down here, even though we don't have data.
Right.
And that's the public policy approach.
But when you look at those levels, are you looking at, it feels as though you're looking at like the, I want to say remediation level, but I know that's not the right word. When you're determining, because you just said, this level, based on, what was it, 7.9 picocuries per gram, you could build a home on. That was based on a residential level. Where are the health studies anywhere that show that if I build my home on 7.9 picocuries per gram, which is well above background on nuclear weapons waste, what happens to my kids in 3 years? What happens when I go out and plant a garden 30 years later?
Well,
they don't exist.
What doses are you talking about? I guess
talking
that's...
about all across. If I build a house on it, my kids will go outside and play and probably eat a little bit of the dirt, probably build a garden.
Right, and these are all, yeah.
I know that ResRad can be used. My understanding is it's never been used at this site. The problem is if you get into plugging numbers into ResRad and you really take the conservative approach like you're talking about, you're not going to like what it says.
Okay.
And that conservative approach, though, is not typically used at these sites. If you really take and consider everything a kid does when they're outside in their backyard playing, and you plug all that in, and the number of hours kids spend outside, you're not going to like what you see in those numbers. And it's
I guess so is the question what the input parameters EPA uses for their regulatory approach, that those numbers aren't correct? I guess I can't speak to...
No, I'm not saying they're not correct. It just sounds like, again, I understand it's what they have to work off of, but if you know anything about what's happening in St. Louis now in Coldwater Creek, we have the first ever health study starting on low-level exposure, and it's not going to be good. It's not going to look good, and I think it's going to challenge this. And I understand that it's not finished yet, and in respect to that, you can't take that into consideration, but I think you have to understand, in terms of Westlake and what we're dealing with and the potential of this fire hitting it and letting it out, you guys could be wrong. And it's not that you're wrong, it's a hypothesis.
Okay.
You have to work off of what you have.
Right.
And one of the things you got to remember is that this is the process that is established in the regulations.
Right.
And this is the process that is followed for all hazardous waste sites in the country.
Right.
So we didn't establish that.
I understand.
This is what all the scientists and the health physicists and all those smart people have come up with, that is the model that the low dose is based on, and that is what we say the process follows. That's what we're saying here.
Okay.
We're not commenting on what was done at West Lake because we have not looked into that, and that's not part
I guess
of what
what
we're
I'm
doing.
saying too is I'm not meaning to point fingers at you and suggest that you're not. I see you guys as being involved in this long-term for a long time. Whatever needs to happen up here is going to take a long time to do. That's obvious. And I'm asking, in the time span that it's going to take for the Army Corps to work with EPA and find a final solution at this site, you will have a health study that comes out. Are you guys willing to work with us based on the findings of that? You're unfortunately, you're in the most unique situation I think that you could possibly.
That's not something that we can answer, all right? When you want to change a regulation, one study would have to be studied, and it would have to go through a lot of different people and a lot of different vetting if it were ever going to be adopted for nationwide application. So, the timing of that study, I don't see it happening. And in terms of being able to apply at this site, but again, we don't make that call.
Are you saying you think it's gonna be faster, whatever happens at this site, or?
No, what I'm saying is we don't get to make the call. There's a regulation that has to be followed.
Right.
That's what's in law right now, and that's what's followed, and that process is followed.
Okay.
Okay, next question is right back here.
Hi, my name's Tanya Mason. I have a question. When they do the assessments, like the assessed over by the airport, which Windsor took over and they're cleaning, Army Corps is cleaning up now, it's the same waste that's put over here. Why was it assessed differently? Was it because of the magic fence? Because you mentioned the fence, but it's the same stuff. So why is EPA handling this and Fisher and Army Corps is handling that? It's the same stuff.
Why it's being handled different, I think that's the same question that was before, and if you want to know why, something specifically what's being handled different, let us, put that in writing and submit it to Ben Washburn. Where's Ben?
The federal government chops it up, that's what happened.
And I think that's actually a valid question, and I want to call you out for your elected officials, because there was an agreement reached between the Department of Energy and our government that got Department of Energy out of this. Otherwise, it would have fallen under FOOSRAP. But they pushed and pulled every string they could in Washington, D.C. for this to fall under the EPA's jurisdiction. And that these folks can't answer that question. I'm sorry, EPA can't answer the question. You have to go higher up than them. In the back.
Hey, I think it's Terry. I'm going to have to ask you and, I'm sorry, Joe?
Yes.
To have a little clarification discussion here. In the document you prepared, Terry, you make a reference to the EPA level of 50 milligrams acceptable, being a 3 out of 10,000 risk. And Joe, you just presented 1 out of 10,000 risk as a threshold. Can you guys kind of resolve that for me?
Yeah, well, the EPA has issued an OSMR directive about this. Fundamentally, the 1 in 10,000 risk is not a hard line. I guess if you have questions about how EPA establishes an acceptable risk range, that'd be a question for EPA. But you're correct, 15 millirem is about 3 times 10 to the minus 4.
So it's 3 out of 10,000, so it's 1 out of 3,333
Yeah,
people are going to have an extra case.
correct. But I would say that the remediation goals aren't established at 15 millirem, they're established on the circular risk range. But if you have questions about how EPA has established a 1 in 10,000,
Well, I'm confused because you're saying 1 in 10,000.
it's, if I put it, it's,
You just say that
it's
they
a,
released a.
there is an OSMR directive.
And could you
that
explain
deals
what that
with
is,
this.
please?
Maybe EPA can do a better job, but it's a directive from their Office of Solid Waste and Environmental Radiation. It's basically an EPA issued document discussing exactly this, and when 50 millirem is appropriate as clinical criteria and when it's not.
Okay, so earlier we had 7.9.
Basically, the easy answer to the question is that, as Joe said, the 1 in 10,000 is just not a hard number. And I've worked at a lot of different Superfund sites, and sometimes the number will be a little bit above 1 in 10,000 for various reasons. And I think that's probably the best answer you'll get tonight on that question.
This is Terry Bukowski, who kind of works for us through a grant with the EPA. She helps us understand technical issues and presents us with papers that help us weed through the mess in front of us.
Terry Bukowski, the task program. So I'm sorry that's not a better answer, but 3 in 10,000 is 3 times more than 1 in 10,000, but when you look at a risk range, it's also still pretty small. I'm not justifying that number, but it doesn't, as a reviewer of technical reports, 3 in 10,000 does not alarm me. If it was 30 in 10,000, I'd start asking some questions. We oftentimes look at order of magnitude, when we look at where levels are.
Sorry.
Oh, no, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead. Yes.
I was wondering, when you said 1 in 10,000, Jeff, I'm in the medical field, so I don't want to get morbid or anything, but curiosity, when you say that statistic, does that mean that a doctor has to say that this person died of this exposure to this site, blah, blah, blah? When you have many sites where many people over the years, or 25 years later, where thousands have developed some type of cancer, children that developed asthma, and then later on developed other illnesses that led to cancer. And that was at one site out in California they studied for 25 years. So what if nobody signs that, which is hard to prove, but you have to go to court saying that your cancer was caused due to this site and the exposure? And if you don't get anybody to sign that on a death certificate, how do you ever come up with 1 in 10,000? If nobody ever says that it's from the site, there could be thousands dying, but there's no, do you know what I'm trying to say? And there's no written
I think so.
for you guys to have.
Is there a formula to back that?
Well, yeah, when we discuss the risks from low-level exposure to radiation, there are very well-established numbers for exposure to high levels of radiation, again, based on the leukemia studies from Japanese survivors. I mean, there are definitely levels where there is an established risk, and those risks are roughly linear. So when we take those high doses and extrapolate them down, that's how we get to the 1 in 10,000 number.
It almost takes an act of God for somebody to say that this person developed brain cancer because they lived by a site for 25 years, and people are still fighting it after their loved ones have died because the site refuses to say, or I'm not saying you're whoever, the government or whatever, said, oh, they never died from that exposure. So how do you come up with 1 in 10,000 when people are still fighting after death to prove that their loved ones passed away from exposure to radiation?
Or any number of other
I'm just curious
pathogens.
how that comes up.
And actually, do you want to speak to this?
I gotta ask somebody else that question.
Well, no, it's just so very difficult to draw that.
Could you identify yourself for the record, too?
Eric Harmon, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. And from a health perspective, it's so difficult to say what actually causes cancer. There are so many different things that can contribute to one getting cancer. From genetic predisposition that maybe you've had in your family, from combined with exposure that maybe you get some.
Yeah, I've been in the medical field 40 years, so I know all that.
And we don't
I've read that
understand
100 times.
We don't understand it, and so what we do in the medical field is that we look and we say, well, from these high-level exposures, these cancers were generally developed from X exposure. So you look to see, is that here or is it not? And then what maybe did you do in your life? Did you have a hobby that maybe contributed to some other exposure? Maybe you got some other exposure from some other place. It's so very, very difficult.
Well, it goes back to my point saying unless you can prove that it is, and you have, where hundreds of people have died of cancer around the site, and they still aren't getting any, like other death certificate, died from exposure to radiation. They try to make it due to your genetics, due to this, due to that, when it's just odd, and many people here know, lay people, we know that a lot of it is caused from that, but it's never written down. So if it's never written down and proven, how does it become a statistic in the, for the government to have on their standard protocol? That's all my question.
well,
You
Don
may not
Chapman-
know that answer.
Don Chapman actually mentioned
Yeah,
the
it was just
first
something that if anybody knew.
the first entomological study of that type is actually starting here in St. Louis County. But again, you're talking about statistics, and Mary, you want to comment also?
I'll take a stab at it.
Please, please.
Okay, I don't want to interrupt you, Doug, but I'm Mary Peterson with the Environmental Protection Agency, and I'll take a stab at this as best I can. So what Joe was talking about was how we do risk assessment, okay? It's not based on statistics, okay? It's not based on actual cases of cancer that are developed. What it's based on is data that we collect from the site. Okay, we look at the concentration that people are exposed to. We look at exposure pathways to calculate a probability. That's what the 1 times 10 to the minus 4, okay, the 1 in 10,000, that's a probability. Okay, it's not based on cases of cancer, it's based on a probability that people could have an increased risk of getting cancer. That's on top of the risk that you already have from all of the kind of everyday sources that Joe pointed out in this presentation. Okay, so the 1 times 10 to the minus 4, these are probabilities. So it's based on the data we collect at a site, coupled with exposure pathways, coupled with some assumptions. I think one of the slides you showed all of the things like how much soil you take in. Don, I think you were talking about this, how much soil a child might ingest, over what period of time. Okay, so all of these exposure assumptions are put into this calculation that spits out at the end of the pipe a probability, and that probability then, if it falls outside a certain range, which is generally the 1 in 10,000, it has to exceed that level for us to even have the authority to take an action. Okay, so we calculate a risk, and that tells us when we have the authority to take an action. It's not tied to the number of cases of cancer.
I think her
So does
question,
that help at all?
well, I think her question was actually and there's no good answer for this, is the fact that the 1 in 10,000 is a probability based off of possibly skewed data, but we don't know because there's never been a study done for this stuff, ever. And so you have to make an assumption somewhere. We know, it's like asking how many cigarettes do you smoke before you get harmed? And that's really the operative question here. Nobody knows. We know that you smoke a lot of them, something bad happens. We know that. And that's the same case with radiation. And unfortunately, there's no way to isolate somebody in a bubble and take them away from consuming food that might have been exposed to something, pesticides in the air, any number of other things to come up with a solid number that says this many rads a day is going to hurt you, or millirems in this particular case. So yeah, I guess they're operating on the best assumption they can make.
And one other point I might add too is I think in a future CAG meeting, Robin alluded to this earlier, is tonight was to talk more in terms of general, how do we do risk assessment? And then at a future CAG meeting, we'd like to talk about the actual West Lake risk assessment. And we can get more into the details of how many grams of soil went into calculating that number. Okay.
Now, any more questions? I know Dawn. Okay, go ahead, Dawn.
When you're calculating risk, like you said, it's a probability thing. And are you looking at it sounds like you're looking at like cancer risk. What about risk, like in terms of radiation, to like lupus and autoimmune diseases and stuff like that? You know, reproductive issues, birth defects, stuff like that. And then it's kind of twofold. When you're doing this, I know you. What is it called? A hazard
index.
Quotient. A hazard quotient. When you're looking at like picocuries per gram, and say you're looking at like thorium or whatnot, it's radiotoxic, so it's toxic too. Is the toxicity of the element included?
Yes, the risk assessment includes both what's carcinogenic or cancer risk, and it includes non-carcinogenic or the non-cancer effects as well.
But is that just based off of its radioactivity, or is it based off of its toxicity also?
Toxicity is also taken into
So
consideration.
it's two different columns, basically.
Yes.
So is there like a separate formula? So when you're doing this, is there a separate formula where you calculate the risk based on the radiation and you calculate the risk based on the toxicity?
Well, there's two different formulas for the carcinogenic risk and then for the non-carcinogenic risk.
And then at the end, when both of those are applied, you combine them to get your overall
You don't really
risk.
combine them. They're two separate entities. So non-carcinogenic risks, we don't express those in terms of 1 × 10⁻⁴. It's more this hazard quotient or hazard index that you were referring to.
Right.
And so generally anything exceeding a hazard index of 1 is something that we would consider taking an action on. So it's like a totally different scale, really, than carcinogenic effects. And I think this is actually a great topic for the next CAG meeting when we can get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty on the West Lake risk assessment.
I agree.
Okay.
And more questions? Yes.
Yeah, I had another question. I forgot to mention floodplain a while ago, and I was telling you all the situations that exist in this particular spot. And I guess there's like 8 of you here from the EPA and the Corps, or 9. I may not have counted everybody. I guess with what you know already, how many of you would be willing to buy a house right near this particular site? You know what?
Really? Yeah, right?
Sure.
You wouldn't have any, you're saying you wouldn't have any qualms?
But you just said
Not-
you don't know West Lake specifics.
Yeah, we have any qualms with regard to
With regard to-
radioactivity and contamination. No, and I actually have quite a bit of family in this area, so not right in Bridgeton, but fairly close of St. Charles neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, you understand that the kind of worry that's here, and this is good information for everybody, but it's also very slow. It's taken a long time to get anywhere. It's the federal government, which works slowly, so does our city government, we all do. But, you know, where is the urgency here? I guess that's what I'm trying to ask. Where is the urgency? The fire has been going on since, I think, 2011? 2010. And, you know, they've talked about building this isolation barrier, and they haven't been able to find any place that's going to work, which they probably knew in the first place, maybe that it wouldn't work because, you know, the stuff is seeped out. So there are so many concerns. And the man that's here from Republic, taking notes, has heard all this too, and I'm sure he'll take this back to the company. And, you know, there is a big concern living near this, that people can't sell their houses. Who wants to buy it? Who wants to buy their house? With all that.
You're talking about quality of life.
Exactly.
Forget the cancer risk. How about the people in our neighborhood can't put their kids in above their strollers and take them out because the kids can't breathe, or the ones that have asthma, their asthma is becoming worse. You have two elderly neighbors that live across the street from me that I help care for or go visit. They can't even sit out in their back porch anymore because the wife is like 91, perfectly alert, no problem, but her asthma and congestive heart failure has increased in the past 5 years. How about the children and the dogs that are outside that are coming with eye infections? All the people that have watering eye infections are going to the doctors. I know 10 people on my street, their dogs and them all have eye infections from sitting outside. And I'm talking about you maybe not be able to do anything and forget the cancer risk because I'll be dead and gone. I'm thinking most of the other kids that are coming with quality of life, where you can't walk around the neighborhood with your dog and your child in the stroller. Doesn't anybody and all out there in Phoenix or anybody here care about the quality of life of the people that are living within their backyard, this friggin' landfill with a fire in there? We're not talking about people 500 miles away and they're going to try to come in, or 100 saying they're complaining. They have a complaint too with that problem. But we're talking about people that live in the backyard. You can't tell me that you would buy a house in the backyard of this landfill. I don't believe it. I don't believe anybody here would have the guts to admit that they would want to live here. And we're talking about quality of life, and there seems no urgency for it. And I'm in the medical field, and I just get really upset about it, like everybody else. You don't have to be in the medical field to get upset. Maybe I'm more passionate because that's my personality. The quality of life, the two people that are 90 years old can't even sit in their front porch anymore, and you know, they're not long for this life. But that's ridiculous, and then nobody cares about that.
Yeah, it would be nice if we could schedule in stenches coming.
I'm just
So
saying
that we
that
can adjust our lives around it, rather than abruptly being awakened in the middle of the night because you smell the crap coming through your windows and you're thinking, what the heck, am I dreaming? Yeah, I'm living a nightmare.
Thank you. You gotta get to close your window when it's 70 degrees out.
No.
Have the reason.
When you drive,
Folks.
you get your air conditioning on, the stuff comes in your car, you turn your air conditioner off, you
Yep.
stop it, and
Now-
the next morning when you start your car, it hits you again.
Now, there will be a spot.
I'll sell it to you.
No, let's talk.
No, actually, this is a meeting, and actually, I get to decide who talks, believe it or not, by bylaws. But we need to get back on page here, and I appreciate what everybody's saying, because that's why everybody's in this room tonight. That's why I'm in this room tonight, because this has become unlivable. And I do need to get us back on page and say, are there any other questions to help with anyone's understanding of how risk assessment is done?
I have something to say.
Do you have a question about risk assessment?
I have something to say, yes. I was born and raised in Spanish Village from 1971 to 1977. I buried my 12-year-old daughter to a glioblastoma brain tumor. I have 3 other children at home sick. I pulled my littlest one out of her school and moved her further away to get her away from this landfill. The school I've been attending since 1998. I had a
And
Do you?
I would
Because I
bear in
can't
mind,
physically just bury another child, okay? I can't. And you tell me.
and I want you to be able to see these things. There is a portion of our agenda to speak with the EPA, and they will take public comment. They will also take questions. And you can also speak to the EPA one-on-one after the meeting. Right now, I'm trying to get folks to understand how these guys make a risk assessment.
Okay, but the EPA.
And I know your story.
Assessment. Go over to Coldwater Creek and pull up their maps. We have the same.
And what your daughter died of is one of the cancers that we find at Coldwater Creek. It is on the list of the diseases found to be caused by these particular radionuclides. We know this, and that begs to other questions. But do we have any other questions about risk assessment right now? Okay, then I would like to, Harvey.
Thank you. On one of your slides, you had a 7.9 for West Lake. Is it possible, I guess we're going to spend another session going into the details of what that number means, where it came from, and most importantly, the definition of RIM when it comes to building the isolation barrier. So whatever that base number is plus X is going to be considered RIM. So I would really like your
Data background of 1.6, I believe it was. I think what Harvey's asking is the background number that we'll be talking about and what the definition of RIM will be in digging the trench, and which is actually going to be part of the detailed discussion that we were talking about having. But we should probably talk with Mary after the proper meeting to talk about a technical committee meeting where we can bring some of these more technical things to the EPA on the side and talk about them in layman's terms in the general public meeting. Now, I want to ask one final time questions regarding risk assessment. If we don't have any more, I'm going to thank you both for your time. Yes.
And one that's on, I think, risk assessment, but possibly not on this piece of it. In an article in the newspaper last week, it said that it would look like, and I think it was from the Corps quoting, that it would probably take 18 more months before a decision could be made regarding where to dig the trench. Is a part of that 18 months going to be looking at what are the risk assessments and in terms of the different spots that it's going to be, where it might be dug or where it's not, is what you're talking about tonight in terms of risk assessment going to be involved in determining where that trench would or would not be dug? And if so, a part of that too is why is it going to take 18 months to do that when we've already been working on it supposedly for 9 months?
To answer your first question, no, risk assessment is not part of putting in the isolation barrier. There's a different path. This isolation barrier is a separate action compared to the other path forward, which is finishing the extent of contamination investigation and re-looking at if a supplemental feasibility study addendum in that path and reevaluation if there would be a decision to look at a different remedy.
Nobody
So that's
is going
not-
to do a risk assessment regarding where the trench is dug or how it's dug or anything? Who does that kind of a risk assessment?
What we're saying is that a risk assessment process that we outlined here tonight for the establishment of remediation goals is not part of what we're doing. Now, as the decision to go forward with any kind of construction and design, the safety and any potential exposures or what have you would be considered to ensure the safety of the workers, safety of the residents, and safety of air traffic. Because they're all impacted on this.
Who does those if you're not going to be doing those?
That's not done by a risk assessment. That's done by by putting together a work plan and looking and putting in protective measures in place during the actual work that's being done. That's not done by this risk assessment, which
We're
is done
talking
to
about
establish.
semantics.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think so.
surely they're taking into consideration what's going to be the risk if we dig it here, or what's going to be the risk if we dig it there.
Yes,
Absolutely.
Yes, just not in terms of 1 times 10 to the minus 4. It's a
Right.
different kind of a risk, and we don't call it a risk assessment.
But what I'm asking is, who is doing that kind of thing for the digging of the trench? And why is it going to take an additional 18 months when it's already been supposedly in process for 9 months?
First of all, I want to pick up on something I thought I heard you say, so I want to clarify. I thought I heard you say 18 months before a decision
St. Louis
is
Post
made.
Dispatch.
Yeah, that was quoted, that was
About
a
being
quote
done.
from.
Okay, so I want to clarify, I think the estimate in the Corps' report of 14 to 18 months was kind of a projection, and that was for the time it will take to complete the design. So that's much different than the time it's going to take before a decision is made to do a barrier, right? So the 14 to 18 months is the time frame for the design to be completed.
That's correct.
Looking at my former partners here, and they're confirming for me that that was the 14 to 18 month time frame. So right now, the timeline that we're on, okay, because I think you all saw, we posted on our website, the report from the Corps was transmitted to the PRB. They were put on a 45-day timetable to turn in a more detailed report, plans for the alternatives and bird mitigation plans. So we're on a timeline, okay, to make a decision regarding an isolation barrier within the next couple of months. And then the 14 to 18 month time frame was for the design. Is that, okay?
All right, and you guys are finished with the presentation parts. Okay, and Mary, hang tight with me for the microphone, and I want to just pick up on this. I made a commentary at the beginning of the meeting. There is a report by the Missouri Department of Natural Resources about the progress of the fire. Now, we have concern that these particles can become airborne if they're hit by the landfill fire. The rate the fire has been progressing, we were told that the final deadline to hit the neck was February of last year. Luckily, that seemed to be wrong, so that's good. But now we've hit the neck, and it looks like we're gone beyond. We don't know how much far beyond because we don't have detection over there. I understand your position. I understand that these things take time. And I understand that you're dealing with Republic Industries, which you have to negotiate with. But are there any other possibilities that EPA would look at as an emergency action, considering the situation that we're in, aside from this barrier? The barrier is a court-mandated project by our Attorney General, and I understand that you're mandated to do it. But given the prospect that there would be a risk of airborne particles if this fire hits the thing, are there other options? Is there something else that the EPA would put its foot down and say, hey, we're taking action, this is going to happen under emergency protocol? I'm asking you that, and it's a legal question you might not be able to answer, but please.
Yeah, I don't have a specific answer, but I do want to speak to what I know about the report that came out last week. And my understanding is that the MDNR's expert essentially indicated that the data indicates, or there may be some concern about movement, and generally it's requiring or requesting additional data be collected, which I understand the MDNR has asked or ordered, perhaps Republic Services, to put in some additional wells and to collect that data. So the bottom line is there really isn't a conclusive, I don't think there's been conclusive evidence of the movement of the SSA. That's my understanding, is that there are differing opinions on that. And we also have EPA's Office of Research and Development that reviews that data, so I have not heard a conclusion from our Office of Research and Development to corroborate or not corroborate the conclusions that were drawn by
This is Matt Levanchi, who's our Assistant Fire Chief here, and I know that he's very up to speed on what is going
Yeah,
on.
and Doug, if you will, I just want to clarify a couple things before we go any further. Your statement earlier tonight said that Todd's report indicated that the fire has moved past the neck. That is not correct.
Okay, good.
Todd's report indicates that based on the information that he has, the same information we look at, and I've been speaking about for the last 3 months at these meetings, is there's not adequate information to determine exactly where that fire line is currently. Based on the information that he has, he's drawn the conclusion, similar to the hypothesis that we've talked about tonight, that it indicates to him that it's possible, and that being the key word, possible, that that fire line has made it to the last row of interceptors. The last row of interceptors is still well within the neck. There is no indication, and I'll say this again, that the fire has moved past the neck. So to make that statement, that needs to be pointed out, and I should have done it earlier, but I had to bite my tongue, but that is not the case. The fire is not past the neck.
Good.
What I've also been assured of, based on conference calls with MDNR, is that there are other alternatives that are being sought that were, it's hard to say this, ideas and principles that Todd presented within the last 2 years, going back to inert gas injection, those items are also back on the table now as far as what I have been told. Now the thing you have to keep in mind, that's with DNR, that's with their engineers, that's with talking with Todd himself. But those are some of the things. Now the question about the EPA stepping in and mandating some of those things, that's beyond their jurisdiction. They are in charge of the Superfund site that deals with the radioactive material. The MDNR has the jurisdiction, along with the Attorney General, based on the 2 previous lawsuits, to go back to court and force them if they don't agree to some of these things. What I have been told, and I've not been in any of the technical meetings, which that happened some months ago, but they have kept me out of those meetings, but what I have been told is that they have asked for this additional information, and the landfill owner has agreed to give that information, and that information is the CO data from the gas interceptor wells. So that's as much as I know. And
that's great.
And I'm sorry if I don't have any other information, but there is definitely a difference between saying that the fire is past the neck and where it is actually.
So I totally misread the report, and I took it as the heat index on the last row of wells indicated past. But this is the question I have, though. MDNR is responsible for the landfill subsurface smoldering event. EPA is responsible for radiologically impacted materials. The two are getting closer. The trench, if you will, is actually a response of the fire, which is MDNR's jurisdiction, and EPA is volunteered, and we've got the Army Corps helping out to do the construction here. Where do we go? I mean, I guess we go to the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, but I'm pretty familiar with our state's budget, actually. I don't know where we would come up with the cash to do anything quickly on our own. So what do we do in emergency situations? The EPA is still, where does your line stop and start? I mean, in all honesty, as we hunt and peck through and find there's more rim than we thought there was in different places anyway. There's rim in different places than we thought they were in. Where does this line stop and start? I mean, legally, because it geographically moves.
Well, I think it's pretty much what you said, that EPA has the jurisdiction over the radiologically impacted material, and that's the line.
Except for the trench, which...
Well, I think what we really need to focus on is the path forward, and like Matt was alluding to, the state has asked or directed Republic Services to put in the additional wells. I think there is something called a heat removal pilot study, and so there are some technologies that are going on the landfill side that the state is working with Republic to put in. Then there's work going on the NPL, National Parties List, the Superfund side, in partnership with the Corps on a pathway forward to look at the alternatives to put in isolation barriers. So these things are going on concurrently, and I think that is the path. That's the path.
Good enough? Okay. And Ed?
I mean, I know the EPA has its path forward, but there's a path that a lot of folks in the audience would like to see, and that's for the EPA to not have its sole contingency plan be this isolation barrier. And we've heard the EPA say that its contingency plan for the fire is the isolation barrier, but the fact of the matter is the radioactive wastes have not been properly identified. The EPA currently doesn't know where they're all at. So what is the contingency to the contingency? And if you don't have the answer now, then hopefully we can get one in a week, because a lot of what the two data sets that came out last week about the Corps' timeline and Thalhammer's report on the possibility of the fire moving past the last line of the gas interceptor wells, which he needs more information for, that's a very real fear that a lot of these folks have. And we'll go to the DNR too, just like we go to you guys about what are you going to do. The DNR is not here, and you guys are in charge of the radioactive waste. You make it sound as if you're not going to do anything until the fire is at the doorstep, and that's not comforting to a lot of folks here.
Thank you.
The question is can we get a response if the EPA will have a contingency to the contingency in a week?
If ORD already said that it was going to be hazardous and the fire touched the radioactively impacted material, then why are we going to do this?
It is all technically a Superfund site.
I'm going to respond to something, Ed, you said about how EPA is waiting until it's at the doorstep.
I said you're speaking as if the EPA will not react until the fire has reached the radioactive material. That's the...
No, we're on a path right now. We're not waiting until it's at the doorstep. Okay, there's two things going on. There's the state mandated actions that are going on the landfill side, where Republic Services is taking some, I think, aggressive steps to try to look at this heat removal technology, okay, to not only monitor, but control the spread of the SSE. And then on the EPA side, okay, we're working with the Corps to put in, or to look at alternatives for a barrier. So you really, we're almost evaluating kind of two levels of protection there so that the SSE never gets to the rim. So in my mind, that kind of is a contingency upon a contingency already.
Republic Services didn't listen to the state of Missouri when they said excavate the neck of the landfill a year and a half ago, when there was still that opportunity. So my faith in Republic isn't best right now. And here's a suggestion then, and I'll shut up, is remove Republic Services from the decision-making process on the isolation barrier and have the government take it over completely. The one thing that the Corps laid out several times in the report was that the negotiation and back and forth process is going to contribute to this lengthy process. Well, if the Corps of Engineers, which is literally a bunch of different engineers, takes over the creation of this isolation barrier, you don't have to worry about going back to Republic Services for their permission on what to do, or have to deal with some of their, from what I've seen, goofy math and erroneous conclusions on what happens if the fire reaches radioactive material.
Every minute is we gotta wait and see if we're gonna live through this thing while we're taking 18.
Harvey, I'm after Dawn here, okay? Go ahead, Dawn.
I just want to allude to that. I don't know if EPA is aware. I know Ben is. I talked to you on the phone. We met with the Attorney General and his litigation staff last week. Let's get this straight. Republic's not playing ball here. The state of Missouri is spending millions, end up spending millions of dollars on this for litigation, okay? If they have to go to court with this company, you best goddamn well believe, that they're not doing the right thing. They're not a good corporate citizen. Talking to the gentleman over here taking notes, you can say I'm saying this. They're not doing the right thing. They're not taking the fire experts' opinions. They're not letting the fire department be in on these technical meetings. This is ridiculous. Please do not come in here and pat them on the back. Okay, don't do it.
We have pushed hard.
No, your attorney general
To get
is
to where we
fighting
are.
like crazy against this company to get basic things about where this damn fire is. That should be given right now no matter what. I do not want to hear that this company is doing the right thing. And any of the risk assessments that have been talked about tonight from the feasibility study that you're going to go over in detail, this company's engineer did those. You guys, EPA, you have amazing scientists. You've proven it with your ORD report. That was fantastic what you did. But you don't get to come in and tell this company what should happen with this trench. Just like the Army Corps comments. Those were amazing. Those are amazing comments. But you don't get to suggest things to this company. It's a back and forth thing, a Superfund. And as long as this company's misbehaving like this community's lost all faith in them. So you're going to come back in and talk about risks to us, risks that were developed by the company responsible for paying and determining what happens with this waste. It means nothing. It really does.
So my only response to that is, you know, our regulation is based on an enforcement first policy. We always identify potentially responsible parties and we look to them to fund, as opposed to taxpayers funding investigations and cleanup actions. So this is the normal course of business for Superfund, and so let me just finish here. The work that's done by any potentially responsible party, Republic or any Superfund site, is overseen by EPA. We pull in experts as we need to through ORD, the Corps of Engineers. Okay, we pull in expertise from other federal agencies to assist us in overseeing to make sure, so we don't just take their word for it.
But you did
okay?
for the 2008 record of decision, or you would have taken a fire into consideration for the risk, and we would not be in the situation as a community we are now.
So what I'm telling you is EPA is doing the oversight. You acknowledge yourself that ORD made great comments, okay? So, and we now have the Corps. Everybody acknowledges their expertise that's come to bear here. So I think we've really pulled in the right resources to do a thorough job of overseeing the work that Republic is doing.
But you've expanded the length of time now it takes to get anything improved. It's great that we have the right people involved, but I think what Ed's trying to say is when you have FOOSREP involved at this site, you eliminate a lot of the back and forth that goes on under Superfund. Again, you're bringing great people in, you've done amazing things. It's just that now with the Corps' comments and your comments and ORD getting involved, which I would like to see ORD comment on anything that comes out of Republic Services, by the way. I'd like to see the EPA's own scientists look over that, check the math, check it again, make sure there's no weird decimal places going on. But you know, that's my thing. I'm going to recognize that you guys have gotten involved, but it's extending the length of this, and it's excruciating to this community.
It does extend the timeline, but we've got to do the oversight for the reasons you said, because work done by potentially responsible party, any potentially responsible party, needs to be overseen, and that's what we do. It does extend the timeline, you're right.
You do understand, though, what I'm saying about the 2008 record of decision. You do understand that the DNR's report about the groundwater now, that all just, it's a trust issue here, and I know that you guys are looking at it, but somebody didn't look at it back in 2008, and that scares these people. That scares me. There were mistakes made on that record of decision, and yet Dan Gravat's up here 2 months ago stating that the record of decision still stands. That is such a botched record of decision, you know? And then you answered Ed Smith last time and said that there won't be a baseline risk assessment for a landfill fire. How? It just feels like not everything's being calculated, but then the stuff that is taking so long. I understand it. I wish you would understand when you patted Republic on the back, that's not okay. That's just not. And I know you're trying to remain a good relationship.
I wasn't necessarily intending to pat anyone on the back. I was just acknowledging the work that's being done. That's all.
It would have been nice if it was done 2 years ago. And we wouldn't have had to.
In the back, Harvey.
Thank you. Mary, I really appreciate your ad hoc willingness to stand out there.
Doing my best.
So please always understand you can come back with an answer as well.
Sure.
Good answers are more important than, and so far your answers have been great. You just have my empathy from the top. But that said, I have to go back to this conversation advice of City Fund and the Corps of Engineers involvement at this point goes back to this most recent report that they issued on the tree alignment alternatives. My understanding is the way that the system is working, even with the Corps of Engineers involved, is they were given tree alignment alternatives by the PRDs to evaluate. Nobody has yet gone to the Corps of Engineers and said, what would you do to fix this? So we're still working under the constraints of our scientists evaluating what the PRDs want us to look at, and not coming up with their own best opinion. And I don't know how to fix that, but I really guess that's the question. Can that be fixed? And just to emphasize how obvious it is that what's going on here, Director Brooks himself has said to this community on many occasions that the PRPs will, that Republicans of the PRPs will not be allowed to dig into the nuclear waste. You've said that clear and concisely a number of times. Why then is Alignment 1 and our taxpayer money, I assume, being spent to evaluate Alignment 1, which involves digging into red?
Preliminary response, I just want to let everybody know we're down to the 2-minute warning. I've got one question up front here, but go ahead, Mary.
Well, to your first point, which had to do with the various alternatives and the core being somewhat, I guess, restricted, for lack of a better term, I think is kind of what you were saying. You know, my understanding is there's pretty open dialogue, I think, going on between the technical folks at EPA and the Corps. And I think if there were a real obvious, you know, fantastic solution that was not one of the ones that was being considered, pretty confident that the Corps would have brought that to our attention. And so I'm looking at Robin to confirm it tonight for me. But
Robin, make it clear, Robin, is that in your scope of work?
We have not been asked to provide that input. That's what I can say.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. We've been asked to evaluate 3 alternatives that the RPs provided.
Okay. Well, and then your second issue.
My second issue is, why do we allow, why do we even allow, I thought the taxpayer money is paying for the Corps of Engineers as a contractor in EPA. Why do they even allow number 1 to see the light of day when Director Brooks has said over and over again that the isolation barrier will not be dug into granite?
Yeah, that's probably one of the ones I'm going to have to take back and get back to you on that.
Okay, and a question right here.
A little bit off of the isolation barrier. My name's Debbie Disser. Thanks.
Speak softly.
Hi, I'm Debbie Disser, and I have a question. It's not about the isolation barrier. We've been having some pretty severe storms around here lately, and I'm wondering, does anybody go out to check to see if there's been lightning strikes up on the vegetated sides of Area 1 and Area 2 to make sure there's no smoldering up there to start a surface fire?
That, I don't know the answer to that question.
Can you find out?
So, sure. We
Okay.
Do these, are these maybe going to get captured? And
Yes, yes, actually they are. All, right behind you, everything's being captured, and apparently all around us. Okay, the last couple of questions. You guys have had a lot of chances tonight. Go ahead. Yes, you.
Donna Coffey, I'm curious, your answer, or whoever answered Balhammer's study, mention was made that the reason for this time span stretching out so long was we found more radioactive waste, so now we have to test the landfill to find out where all the waste is. Am I misreading that? Did someone else read that also? We're trying to find out. The delay is because, you know, we don't know where it all is. So is there any plan to find out where it all is?
Yes, there is additional investigations planned to locate the extent.
Last time they dug a hole, you know?
Well, this is connected to the plans for the isolation barrier. So once the work plans have been submitted, that will be part of the design. And again, I'm looking at the Corps to confirm. My understanding is that will be part of the design phase, is the additional information gathering or investigation for the extended rim. Is that correct?
That's correct. The first thing that hasn't happened is the selection of the
How do you design something and you don't know where the rim is?
Well, we've got 3 people asking the same question, so.
Part of the design phase.
It's
part of the design phase.
The answer here is it's part of the design phase that then they'll actually do the testing to verify the
That's
path.
commonly done. It's commonly done.
All right, Ed, last question tonight, quickly.
Did he get his question?
Oh, I don't know. I missed somebody. Oh, Bill?
My name's Bill Wilson. I live in Spanish Village.
That's all you got.
I don't have an engineering, nuclear engineering degree, anything, or anywhere close to it. And all of this data that you presented tonight and risk assessment and levels of radiation and all that, that's so far above my head as it probably is most, a lot of other people in here. It just seems to me that the EPA and the other organizations that y'all are working with are doing everything that you can to justify leaving that material where it is. The bottom line for me is, if that material is so safe, why has it been moved 3 times currently to its current location where it was moved illegally? I'd like to have an answer for that.
And Mary's basically saying it's a philosophical question, I guess. EPA stuck with it. She doesn't have an answer. But it's a very good question.
I got the.
Oh, you do?
Talking about the history of the rad material?
Yeah.
There's actually a really good history of how this material was moved around the North County area on the FUSRAP website in the St. Louis district. Why? Because it was refined multiple times. The first time it was refined for the Manhattan Project, it was resold, further refined, moved, resold, further refined. It changed hands several times between private entities. Now, there's a lot more detail on the website. I wouldn't do it justice explaining it here, but honestly, not a lot of great decision-making in how that stuff was handled. That's why there's a FUSRAP program, that's why there's a Superfund program, both working in our backyard. So I would recommend getting on the St. Louis District Corps of Engineers site on the FUSRAP program. There's a timeline that talks about how this ended up, where it is in the various places. It's a pretty good detailed report too. So I just recommend checking that out if you haven't been there already.
Now, that wasn't the question. The question was, if it's so safe, as what we're being told now it's safe where it is. Well, if it's so safe, why was it moved 3 other times? Because people didn't want it in their backyard, so to speak.
I think that speaks to the whole bad decision-making processes that led us to have a FUSRAP program and a Superfund program here in our backyards. I don't think anyone would argue that it was a great idea to move this stuff around in open trucks, but we've been remediating it from drainage ditches for the last 17 years because of that.
So it's not safe then? You can't
Well,
really say it's
we're
safe.
talking about different sites and different conditions, so I can't really speak to the Superfund site. I can definitely talk about the FUSRAP site and how that ended up where it is. And we are talking about some of the same materials we've all acknowledged before. However, I can only speak to what the FUSRAP remediation process is and the history of that.
Thank you very much.
It's a very short question.
Very short.
The EPA, if I'm correct, has signed 2 interagency agreements with the Corps, one out of Kansas City and one in St. Louis, correct?
Both Kansas City.
Oh, so there's not a St. Louis FUSRAP interagency agreement with the EPA?
The actual interagency agreement was signed with the Kansas City District and funds were transferred to Kansas City District. We are the project management district. Our team members are made up of St. Louis District personnel as well as Kansas City District personnel. And as we've been indicating before, whatever the project, whatever support EPA needs, if we do not have the expertise either in Kansas City or in St. Louis, we will reach out to other districts within the Corps to get those people that we need. But the actual interagency agreement was signed in Kansas City.
Okay, so then the follow-up question to that is, I believe the interagency agreement talks about support for the isolation barrier and then support for the record of decision amendment, correct?
It's for an independent, the second interagency agreement is for an independent technical review for documents generated as a result of the National Remedy Review Board review of the supplemental feasibility study. And I know that sounds like a lot.
No, I'm more.
But
No,
you're assuming that there's going to be a change in the remedy. That is a step that's 2 steps down. The first thing that has to happen is the supplemental feasibility study addendum. And then once that is
I got that. What the question is will EPA expand the interagency agreement to allow the Corps to go back to the very beginning when the EPA was doing the remedial investigation and the feasibility study and actually look at the elements from which the foundation of this flawed 2008 record of decision were built? And I think that's a very legitimate question because you're now making decisions about this Rod amendment, and as far as I'm concerned, you're not tasked to go back and look at it from the start. And I would like to see that.
Agreed.
that's a question for EPA.
It's the question for the EPA. Will you expand the interagency agreement to include a comprehensive review of the site documents at West Lake?
That's what I'll have to take up. I do understand.
Can I just clarify, I just a small question. Your agreement with St. Louis, some of the people that are in St. Louis, part of the FOOS are not FOOS reps. The Army Corps team, are those FOOS rep people, or are those St. Louis Army Corps, or is there a difference? I know that FOOS rep.
Yes.
Maybe that's right. Is that both?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah, both is the answer.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, folks, we are trying to close the meeting early. We haven't done too good of a job that way. We now have 6 minutes for you to have one-on-one time with any of the folks from EPA or the Army Corps of Engineers or anyone you have detailed specific questions with. So please feel free. We're going to tag along with you and see how things go and take notes. So have a good evening and thank you all for showing up.